So in looking at this concept of faith, we began with human faith, that kind of faith that we exercise on a daily basis with a multitude of things. Anything that's unseen to us, anything that we don't see with our five senses or is not one of these necessary truths. And that's a lot of what we believe and a lot of what we assent to quite firmly. And I give the example of, I believe Alaska exists. I've never been there. I've never seen it with my five senses. It's certainly not a necessary truth, but I firmly assent to it. And why is that? It's because of I've judged certain witnesses to be credible. I've read it in books. I've had teachers tell me about Alaska. I've read National Geographic magazine. My brother's been there. And I judge that these are reliable witnesses. And so my will can choose to assent. My will can choose to command the intellect to assent to that truth quite firmly. And we would call that human faith. Now, when we turn to supernatural faith, we'll see that this is a good structure or framework to understand supernatural faith or matters of divine faith with a few important modifications. And that's because the Catholic faith concerns unseen objects, things like God, heaven, the Trinity, right? These are not things we see with our five senses. They're not in any way necessary truths. And yet our faith says we should firmly assent to them. Well, on what basis then, right? Well, the only morally compelling reason to assent to something unseen is the trustworthiness of a witness, right? I have good reason that the testimony of a witness is true. And so my will can choose to command the intellect to assent to it. But when it comes to these truths, God, heaven, the Trinity, right, these mysteries of our faith, there can be no other sufficient witness than God if he chooses to reveal himself. See, if God doesn't reveal himself, we would have no knowledge of his plan for us, of the fact that he's a Trinity, of his plan of salvation. But there is a sufficient witness to these things if God chooses to reveal himself. But God, who is the first truth, who can neither deceive nor be deceived, has indeed revealed himself. Right? So this, God's revelation, is the source of the firmness of divine faith and the grounds for the moral duty of believing. God's revelation, the fact that he has disclosed these things, means that he is the credible witness to these things. And so if we know that God has revealed himself and he can't deceive us, he can't lie, he can't be mistaken, then that gives us the firmness of our faith. That's the motive that can command our will, by which our will can command our intellect to assent. And it also gives us a moral duty of believing if God has actually revealed these things. But that leaves the question, how do we know that God exists in the first place? Or that he has revealed himself, and where, right? If faith is based on God revealing himself, well, how do we know that he has and where? And this is where the work of reason can begin to help answer these questions. Philosophical reason and historical reason. So philosophical reason is the work of coming to know that God exists. Historical reason can give us good reasons to think that Jesus Christ was divine, that he rose from the dead, that he established the Catholic Church to hand on his divine revelation. So this is the prior work of reasoning, which is sometimes called the preambles of faith, right? It's the work prior to faith, right? So faith believes on the credibility of God being a witness to these things because God has revealed himself. Before that, though, this work of reason, the preambles of faith, establishes that it makes sense to believe in those things, that God exists, that he's revealed himself, he's done so in the people of Israel, in the person of Christ, and he's established the Catholic Church. So this is the work of apologetics, which shows the reasonableness of belief in God, belief in Christ, and belief in the Church. Once reason has shown that the existence of the divine witness is reasonable, then it's clear that he's worthy of supreme trust. Once we see through this philosophical and historical reasoning that God exists, that he's revealed himself preeminently in Christ, and that Christ instituted the Catholic Church, then it's clear that he's worthy of that supreme trust, right? That anything he does reveal is a sufficient and, in fact, a superabundant motive for our will to choose to command the intellect to assent, right? That God's revelation can't deceive us, and so is a proper and superabundant motive for our making that act of assent, what we call faith. But then we have to ask again, or we could ask, well, how do we determine where God has spoken? And here too, we can trust the witness of others who preceded Christ, those who accompanied him and who came after him, right? So that would be those who preceded Christ, the prophets, who pointed towards the coming Messiah, those who accompanied him and testified to him, his apostles, and those who came after him, that is the witness of the church that hands on this revelation. And again, that's the work of reason. The recognition of the trustworthiness of these witnesses is partially the work of reason. It would be irrational to believe if reason could not somehow recognize that God himself has spoken in human history. If we just simply on a whim said, I'll go with Catholic, right? Well, why? Just because, right? It's not fully rational to do that. Reason can establish that these things are reasonable to hold, and therefore that we can truly believe and assent to what God has revealed to us. We place our full trust in what God has said, what he's revealed, because reason first shows us that this is reasonable, right? It's not contrary to faith. We don't check our brains at the door when we become Catholic. But then grace gives us the certainty of that judgment. And here's an important element that we're adding in. So far, if you were following along, it sure sounds like we're working this all out by ourselves, right? That reason shows us that God exists, that Christ is God, and that he established a church, and therefore, right, this logical deduction that we can believe what he says, and therefore we have faith. It turns out, we'll see in a second, that even based on this reasonableness of all of this, it's not compelling. It's not enough. It doesn't make it a seen object, right? That our intellects just naturally and spontaneously assent to, right? There's a gap there, and we need God's grace to give us the certainty of that judgment. Left to ourselves, this movement of faith wouldn't happen. It's insufficient on our end alone. But the persuasion of reason, here it is still insufficient in matters of divine faith, right? So we can go all of this way to say, well, it's reasonable. We can see there are philosophical reasons to think God exists. It's reasonable to think that Christ rose from the dead and is God, and that he began the Catholic Church that hands on this revelation. But that persuasion of reason is still insufficient in matters of divine faith to compel an assent, right? When I look at the sky and see that it's blue, that really compels my assent to say that the sky is blue. It naturally and spontaneously, my assent is yes, it is. Even given all of this, that's not enough to compel the assent of faith. If it were, then we could simply provide everyone with the same list of arguments or the same list of reasons, and they'd all suddenly become Catholic. And we know by experience that that doesn't happen. There are at least a couple of reasons here why this persuasion of reason is still insufficient in these matters. The first is on account of the transcendence and transcendent importance of the unseen objects of faith, right? We're not talking about the sky being blue. We're not talking about Alaska existing. We're talking about the ground of all being in God. We're talking about the mystery of his nature in the Holy Trinity. We're talking about the incarnation. These things are beyond our normal experience, right? And they're often contrary to the order of things encountered in our ordinary experience. That's not to say they're self-contradictory or anything like that, but they're very out of the ordinary for us. Right? Things like God is one and God is three, right? That's out of our ordinary experience. We don't say that about other kinds of things. To say that the Eucharist looks like bread and tastes like bread, but is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, well, that's out of the ordinary for our common experience, right? And we tend towards our common experience. We tend towards the mundane. We don't tend towards the transcendent or those things that are outside of our ordinary experience. And so for this reason, even all of those arguments that show the reasonableness of placing our faith in God's revelation isn't compelling to everyone. And second, the divine witness, God, remains unseen. Right? Our witness in this case isn't a magazine we can pick up. It's not an author we can email. It's not my brother who I've known who sits next to me at Thanksgiving dinner. God remains in this sense as unseen as the other mysteries we're talking about. He needs to be recognized as speaking through very humble mediators, which is, again, can be contrary to our ordinary experience, that God speaks through the ordinary human words of the Bible, that God speaks through very ordinary humans like the prophets, that God speaks through a very human institution like the church, right? He uses those very humble mediators to communicate his revelation to us. And so you can see again where this would be a barrier where there can be shown this reasonableness, but it's not compelling. It doesn't necessitate the assent of faith in that sense. So what's required is the help of God's grace. And in fact, we should say that we could start these slides with grace. That when it comes to the assent of faith, God's grace moves prior to the assent of faith, what we call prevenient grace. It comes before. It assists in the act of faith, and it continues along with the act of faith. So God's grace and assistance helps throughout this process, and without God's grace, there is no assent of faith. So what does grace do? Grace is kind of an interior illumination in this sense. Grace illumines the mind to see the motives for believing that the unseen witness is indeed ultimately God speaking through the different mediators, right? Grace gives us the firmness of the intellect to see and believe that that gap between what's reasonable and these other how it's not compelling. Grace kind of bridges that gap to illuminate the mind to see that. The will also needs the aid of grace to strengthen and purify it, to seek the good, to set aside fear and pride and that kind of thing that would block the assent of faith. And for this, the only aid is recourse to prayer. When it comes to God's grace and the assistance that grace offers, the only thing that we can do is ask for that grace to believe in prayer. And so the church actually has traditional prayers that are called the act of faith. So what we'll look at in the next video is the relationship between faith, doubt, and certainty.